My name is Joe Levitt. I am a partner in the D.C. law firm of Hogan & Harson. For my first 25 years of my career, I worked at the Food and Drug Administration in a number of capacities. Finally, I was the director of the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, which is that part of the FDA which regulates all food products, including bottled water, but certainly by no means only bottled water. There's a general sense that bottled water is not very highly regulated by the government, and that's not true. It's just not well understood, and it's not well understood because the real visible food safety issues have not been with bottled water. What I'd like to do is, number one, just describe for you what is the comprehensive regulatory scheme that exists for bottled water under the FDA authority. Number two, then talk about bottled water as a food. But in addition, there are a number of very specific regulations for bottled water, so I'm going to concentrate mostly on those. And then what is the general regime for inspections, enforcement, and product recalls. And then talk a little about how the state governments play an important complementary role to what FDA does. Bottled water is regulated as a food under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which dates back to 1906 and has been amended many times. And there was a whole section, almost a whole book, of the Code of Regulations devoted exclusively to bottled water. And this is the core of the FDA safety regulation of bottled water, is what's called the standards of quality. And these are regulations that establish quantifiable limits for the microbiological, physical, chemical, radiological substances. These very much follow EPA's MCL levels, your maximum contaminant levels that EPA has. FDA essentially adopts them and applies them to bottled water, and there's a whole long laundry list of these, each, again, very quantifiable, and bottled water companies are subject to all of those. Now, importantly, about 15, 20 years ago, Congress passed a law to ensure at least parity with EPA regulations, and that's Section 410 of the FDA law. And what that says is that whenever EPA passes a regulation under a public water drinking standard for a maximum contaminant level or a treatment technique, then FDA is required within a period of time to apply a comparable regulation for bottled water that is at least as stringent and at least as protective of the public health as the EPA standard. FDA also has specific good manufacturing practices of bottled water, and it will address things such as the frequency of contamination testing, requirements for sanitary operations, equipment design and construction, and the production and process controls. You'll see regulations for testing, inspection, sampling, analysis, and approval requirements for source water. And you'll see that testing requirements for finished products. And so again, you're going to see a very elaborate regulatory scheme. It is very interesting, I think, from my broader FDA experience to see how much there is for bottled water when you don't have the same thing for almost any other food product. And I think that is because of the sensitivity of how public water systems are regulated to be sure that bottled water, as I said, is at the same or even a higher level. Finally, FDA does have a system for inspections. All food companies are subject to on-site inspections to ensure compliance. FDA assigns frequency based on risk. That's both the nature of the product and the history of the firm. So a company that has had compliance problems in the past, they're going to be visited more frequently than someone who has a good track record. FDA also relies very much on states to inspect food companies, either on behalf of FDA or under their own authorities. And so you have very much a federal-state partnership there. Now, a couple points on FDA jurisdiction. One of the so-called myths is that FDA doesn't regulate most bottled water because it's intrastate. And people think of it as being intrastate because the source is in the state. But in reality, FDA regulates virtually all bottled water. And the reason is twofold. Number one, it is age-old law by now several decades that if any component of a food travels in interstate commerce, then FDA has jurisdiction over the whole product. So if the cap came from interstate commerce, if the label came from interstate commerce, if the plastic, if the ink on the label came from interstate commerce, it is an absolute myth that bottled water is an intrastate product. It is an interstate product fully subject to regulation.